Hey everybody, this is Mark. Welcome back to Beyond Profit, a Global Perspective. This is a video for you teachers out there. Those of you who maybe you've faced a disengaged, bored classroom. This is going to be a video about encouraging student engagement. We're going to be talking about active learning, and so hopefully there will be some ideas in here that might assist you. Indeed, also using AI in some cases in order to generate different active learning ideas. We're going to talk a little bit about that too. So without further ado, let's get into it. I want to welcome everybody to our workshop here. Of course, our topic here is increasing student engagement in the classroom. We're going to talk about active learning. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. And this is the scenario that we're faced with sometimes. Now, we know what it's like to be in a boring, ineffective classroom, right? Either you've been a student or you've been on the receiving end of students all looking like this at one point or another. Maybe you can't connect. Students aren't paying attention. They're falling asleep, doing things that don't pertain to the class. Maybe you feel like they don't care. They're ignoring you, right? And then there's also unique problems associated with time as well. For those of us who are our main campus instructors, it may be like, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, what do I do with these students, right? How do we get them geared up? For those of you who are teaching the MBA program, you're doing it in person, it's more like, all right, it's 9:30 at night. For the purpose of accreditation, we have to be there the whole time, right? We need to be there from 6 to 9:50. So the question then becomes, like, what do you do with them during that period of time to avoid this scenario from happening? And that's really what this session is going to be about. So first I want to talk a little bit about attention span, a little bit now and a little bit later. So over the past 20 years, the average time that a person can focus on one thing has dropped from about 2.5 minutes to around 45 seconds. This is research from Gloria Mark, professor of informatics at the University of California, Irvine. I'm not sure exactly what her methodology is on this. It must be a pretty freaking boring task from what I could tell. But it has been consistently, whatever this experiment has been going on, it's been going on consistently for a number of years. I would argue if this is strictly true, nobody would ever get anything done. So I think you need to take some of this with a grain of salt. I think it's more useful to think about things in terms of information processing. That attention span is kind of an elusive topic in psychology, and we don't really know that much about attention span. What we know is that the brain has limited ability to process all of the information that comes with it. Psychologists tell us that there's different methods the brain uses in order to try to take it all in, and there's certain factors that affect how well maybe we can focus in on certain tasks. So what affects that? Here's a list of, not comprehensive, but a list of things that psychologists indicate. Things like motivation, interest, need, external distractions, stress, affective emotions, right, sleep, diet. All of these things can affect whether or not your student is tuned out or tuned in. And so my question here is, what can we control and what can't we? Because there's certain things we certainly can, and I'm going to look and sort of focus really on these are things that we can't absolutely control, but there are certain things that we can focus in on that will give us a little bit better hold on our students. Things like sleep, things like diet, are things that, I don't know, I guess you could bring snacks to class or whatever, but there's not a whole lot of control you have over those particular things. Some of these things are, you have some control over to a greater degree or to a much lesser degree, but what you do may have an impact on how they feel about certain things, like motivation, for example. You can motivate certain students extrinsically with grades, right? It's like you do this and you get a good grade, you do that, you get a bad grade. Very simple. But you can also potentially motivate students intrinsically. That is, do something in the class that makes them want to show up because it's fun, because it's cool. We'll talk more about that later, right? Interest, right? Can you generate interest in your subject matter? Can you sell them the idea that this is something interesting or something necessary, right? And I do believe that's sales. I'll say more about that later as well. External distractions, right? We can't control every external distraction that's happening in our universe, but we can control a whole lot of them that happen here in the classroom. Again, we'll go into that too. Stress. We can't control the stress in a student's environment across the board, but we can control some stressors in the classroom. Maybe there's some times where we need to take the stress level down. Maybe there's times where we need to increase the stress level, but that is something that we can affect students in a certain way. And finally, I'll mention here effective in emotions, right? The emotional state students are in, you cannot necessarily control what they come in with, but you might be able to control somewhat what they go out with. There are certain things you can do to create positive atmospheres, environments in the classroom, and in fact, I would also argue that some of the lessons that you teach don't have to be strictly analytical. If you can touch students in a way with not just the academic knowledge, but with something that is emotional, then that has a greater tendency to improve retention over time. And so that's another thing that we can think about as we plan out classes, is how can we appeal to the affective side of people, the emotional side of people. So this is the challenge. So how do we address the challenge? There's two things I want to talk about today that I think will help us with this, right? The first one is pacing and focusing. That is like, how can we adjust the class environment in different ways in order to try to affect that? And the other one really is active learning. So we're going to go into this. I'm primarily going to focus on in-person education. We might talk very briefly about online at the end. So let's start talking about pacing and focusing. The most important thing, I think, nowadays is what I would call controlled use of technology, okay? Students are totally into their phones, they're into their tablets, their laptops, and they're great. I love the technology, and I love using the technology in the classroom. However, that word controlled is a really important one, in that the way I approach my classes, and I would encourage you guys to do the same, we can have a discussion later on this if you disagree, but I basically tell students to start off with is that we're not going to have laptops or phones out in the classroom while we're having discussions. Some people will say, that is how I take notes. To that I will answer that every study that I've read basically indicates that people retain better when they write as opposed to when they type. Now for me, I prefer to type, right? Like that would be, if I were a student, I'd be like, man, I want my laptop, okay? But honestly, shut them down, people can write by hands. It works. It's worked for me. So, I think that's what I would recommend, is that the benefit that you get as a class and the students get from that interaction is worth closing down those laptops and letting them take notes by hand. Even though I don't allow phones in the classroom, I also tell students that, like, if it's an emergency, like they're adults and stuff like that, if they need to go take a text out in the hall, just leave. You don't have to ask me, just go. Come back when you're ready. Now, there may be exceptions where, like, I'd say put it in your bag, right? Like, there may be a time where I'm like, okay, everybody get out your phones, respond to this poll. Everybody get out your laptops, do some research, look up these terms, let's share this stuff. But they're tools, right? They belong in the toolbox until we're ready to bring them out as tools. And the reason why is because they are, quite obviously, I think, incredible distractions. They're distractions for me too. Like if I'm sitting in a room and there's a meeting going on and I feel like whatever I'm listening to for that particular 5-minute period is not the most exciting thing I've heard, I might be inclined to check my sports scores or check my social media. And next thing you know, I'm down a rabbit hole and whatever's happening in the room is not important to me anymore, right? So my argument would be, first step, take that temptation away from the students to start off with. Now, how you enforce that, would be a question that you'd have to deal with your syllabus and your students and so on. But that's something I've been doing for the entirety of my career. It has been extremely effective at getting students to actually talk to me and engage actively in the classroom. Take that thing away and people are going to listen more, just to start off with. I really don't think attention span probably has changed as much maybe as this person says in the last 20 years, but I don't have the data behind it. What I think really has changed are things like the distractions in the environment. And removing those distractions as much as possible, I think, is a crucial first step to trying to get students to focus. I would secondly say it's important to schedule rough but ready breaks. Okay? For those of you who are in the traditional sort of classroom, you probably don't have a lot of room for breaks, but then again, you're dealing with a time period, at least at St. Mary, it's about 75 minutes. But that gets to pacing. We'll talk about pacing in a little bit. For those of you who are teaching night classes, and it is 6 to 9:50 in the evening, that's a different deal, right? You cannot sit those students in there for 4 hours and not give them real breaks, right? So obviously, we're building in 5-minute breaks, I would say maybe every hour. But I would also argue don't be too regimented about that, right? Because when I get to the top of the hour, let's say I'm going from 6 to 7, and the students are on a roll, I'm not stopping, right? Or it's another night, and it's 6:45, and the students are doing this, it's time to take a break. You do it early, right? But you have that flexibility sort of built in. Watch the crowd, that's the other thing. You're making eye contact with your audience, and they're fading away, you're losing them, then you probably need to do something to sort of switch things up a little bit. And that's also what I mean, mixing information, the delivery of information, with the other modes of learning, right? Like, it's one thing for somebody to lecture for a while, but there's times where we also need to hear from students, or students need to do something other than being lectured at. And finally, I would say plan to be flexible. Look at all your slides, look at your activities, look at your lessons. Think about what the best order is when you are planning this, right? If there's a really difficult concept that may be hard for students, or maybe even boring for them, like they may not connect with it, then you may want to start that particular session with an activity that allows them to understand that a little bit more, where you're not explaining it to them, but they're experiencing it. And then when you explain it to afterwards, then they're like, oh wow, okay, I get that, I understand that, right? On the other hand, you may want to save some active learning things for something that happens, let's say if you're in that 4-hour class, for 9:30 in the evening, okay? 9:30 is not the time where people like to sit there and listen. You've got to break things up a little bit and maybe give them something to do. So I would say be very, very deliberate about how you mix things up, and be flexible about how you move things around, because that's a good way to make sure that people continue to be engaged consistently throughout that program. Before I go into active learning, I want to tell you a little story. Okay, so just yesterday, I was talking to my youngest daughter. She just turned 13 years old a couple of weeks ago, and so she's in middle school. She's in the equivalent of a biology class, and this is a simulation, a natural selection simulation that she's doing in her class. And she showed it to me yesterday, and here I am getting ready to do active learning, and I'm checking this thing out. And she's like, Daddy, this is so cool. So she has the ability to manipulate this environment in really interesting ways. The idea is to teach her about natural selection. So what she decided to do is she could change the landscape so it was all blue, and there are predators and prey. You've got like these prey creatures that are ostrich lopes or something, and I don't know what these things are called. They're mean. They eat them, and so like you've got predator and prey. And so she turns the whole landscape blue and turns these bright yellow, so that it was super easy for the predators to eat them, right? But then, in another iteration, she puts spikes on these things, right? And so then the predator has a hard time eating them. Eventually, the predators all die off because they can't eat all these things. And anyway, so different, and you can see what happens to the ecosystem depending on what happens. There's mutations you can put in, like what happens if these guys get spikes and the predators, like one of them has strong jaws, and if that gets carried on. So what was cool about it, the reason why I'm pointing this out to you is like, I'm not taking that class. I'm not that interested in it, but I'm like, dude, I want to play this game. It sounds fun. And my daughter is the same way. She's like, she's not really a natural science sort of person, but she's totally digging this because it is doing an excellent job explaining it, and it's making her curious. It's making me curious. I'm like, what if you put spikes on this thing? What else could you do, right? And that is what is great about active learning. This is sort of the epitome of what we should be doing in a classroom, is fostering curiosity, creating interest, trying to get people to want to learn beyond just the sort of like, I'm in trouble if I don't show up and I'll get a bad grade if I don't do this. So that is the territory that we're going into. So when we're talking about active learning, we're talking about any approach to instruction in which all students are asked to engage in the learning process, right? Which isn't possible if you got people sitting there on the phones on the side all the time. And then students learn by doing, right? So active learning is juxtaposed to traditional learning, where an expert imparts knowledge to passive learners and a few students respond to questions, right? This is our traditional model. Horizontal communication, that's what I'm doing to all of you right now, right? Hopefully we'll do a little more of this later on, as we have just a few minutes ago, but vertical communication, right? We're trying to get everybody involved, talking to each other. I'm part of this too, okay? This vertical communication does not necessarily replace horizontal communication, but as I said, with pacing, you alternate it so that you can make the best of both, because there are times where you are the bearer of information and you have to share it, otherwise they won't know what to do, right? It has to start there sometimes, but making those transitions so that they internalize things by actually taking part, an active part, ownership, and doing things is an important part of that process. So active learning seeks an atmosphere where most or all students are vibrantly interactive, though it may never completely replace traditional methods. It provides students with complementary, engaged learning by encouraging them to participate actively in the lessons. So this is a figure that shows different examples, different kinds of experiential learning on the continuum. But down here in the bottom left corner is simple, up here in the right corner is complex. And I'm bringing this out to indicate that not all forms of active learning need to be complicated. There are some very simple things that can be done at times without a whole lot of planning that are still effective ways to break up your class and get people personally involved. Like some of the most simple things are pause for reflection. Okay? I've said all this stuff. Now I'm going to ask you some questions. Don't talk. Just think. Then maybe bring them in for a discussion. Or, like I said, you can do a minute writing or something like that, a self-assessment. Once you start interacting with other people, you can move toward a think, pair, share, right? I'm going to think about it, and then I'm going to get with another partner and talk to them about it, and we're going to figure out what we got out of this, and then we're going to present this to a larger group, right? So we move from the individual level up to the collective level. And up here you have all sorts of different examples of interactive things you can do with small groups or large groups in order to just get them to talk to each other or get them to talk to you. And I'll give you some more specific examples of things I like in a little bit. And then you can go toward the much more complex, like forum theater. You actually have people role-playing certain things and trying out different positions and acting things out. There's role-playing here as well. Playing games, simulations. I want to talk more about that in a little bit. Case studies is sort of in between, and we'll talk more about that too, because there's different ways you can execute case studies in order to make them more active too. So, point is, you can do something very simple, you can do things very complex, and there are loads of ideas in between. All right, so these are some of my favorite approaches anyway to active learning. Games and simulations are some of my favorite things. Because if you give students a game or simulation, then they are in some ways, the idea is they are acting out something that they should be learning. They are doing things in sort of a practical way. Some of the things that I do in some of my classes, like I teach global management, I have a cultural negotiation game, for example, where students have about 5 minutes to get in groups, come up with their own version of a culture, a country name, and then they have to behave according to that culture that they came up with when they engage in a negotiation with another culture to try to land a trade deal. So they have to role play something that's not normal and natural for them in order to illustrate some of the challenges, cross-cultural challenges that sometimes happen when you engage in negotiations, right? A ticket trade game. I have a game basically, it illustrates free trade, but students go around actively trade different tickets throughout the class. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but suffice to say, they get really excited. At one level, the trade, is sort of very restricted. You can only trade within your own groups, and then it becomes more free trade oriented. Ultimately, anybody can trade anything to anybody, and then we track the numbers to see what happens with trade as people go through these different forms of relative restriction or non-restriction. Mike's Bikes. This is actually a simulation, an online simulation we have built into our strategic management course. And students compete against each other. We put them in groups, and they compete against each other for market share. They do little bike shops and stuff like that. And it's a game that they play throughout the entire term, and they're assessed on it as well. I have also taught legal and ethical courses as well, doing court simulations where you give people the facts of a certain case and then have them hypothetically discover, okay, so you're the judge, how do you decide this? How do you figure this out? Or you're a business person, here's this legal situation, how do you address this? So heavy emphasis on role playing. I believe that case studies can also be turned into role playing opportunities. I've been in loads of business classes where, you know what it's like, you're reading the whole thing, they tell you the background, all the facts, they tell you how it turned out, and then they ask you questions about it. What did we learn from this case study? Okay? What I like doing is tearing off the end of the thing. Just give them the facts and don't tell them how it turned out. And then say, all right, you are this, and you are this, and you are this. Now go. How do you think it should turn out? And then let them role play the different parts, and then we'll see where things go. Is it going to turn out the same way as the real case study did, or is it going to turn out different? Eventually, you do tell them, okay, so this is the real ending, right? How did what you do, or what you decide, how is it similar to the way things turned out, or different from the way things turned out? Right? And that way you put them inside. You get them to actually understand the perspective of the people who are doing the smart or usually stupid things that happen when in all the case studies that we share with people. So these are examples of ways that you can engage in game simulations, role playing, I think, in order to try to have students internalize certain concepts. I think this one's obvious, but I think it's also important to emphasize. Having an open environment for students' questions and comments, right? People ought to feel safe. They ought to feel like whatever point they have to share, they're going to be supported. And so you as an instructor being positive, sort of affirming people as they bring in their comments and encouraging other students to be affirming of each other too, is a way to build that environment where people feel comfortable talking to each other. That's really important. Socratic method is another one I use a lot. When I lecture, I try to avoid giving students information. I prefer to ask them questions and see if they can figure out how to get there. That's a more time-consuming way to try to get to a point. But if you can take a student on a journey and say, hey, this is what I want you to learn, and you just ask them questions and eventually they get there.
Can I interrupt for just a second?
Absolutely, sir.
What if you're asking questions and nobody answers?
I had that problem last week teaching this in this classroom in global management, where I got a room full of students and nobody wanted to answer the question. This is what I did.
You really did?
I did. I literally sat on the floor like this. And I'm like, I got all day.
Did that work?
Yes.
It did. Okay.
Yeah. The problem is sometimes you have to outlast the student. You have to get past the awkward silence. You have to beat them at the awkward silence game.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'll need
So that is what I do. Now, at the end of class, I also chastise them a little bit. Like usually at the end of class, I do this little positive thing where it's like, hey, it's really great. I really enjoyed our time tonight. You know, you guys are great and all this sort of stuff. But this time at the end, I sort of added this thing and I'm like, okay, some of you guys did a really great job taking part. I really appreciate your comments and so on. But this class isn't going to work unless I hear from all of you, right? And you're all diverse people. You all have different points of view. And I need to hear your points of view, right? And this is a safe place for you to do it. It's not going to be nearly as safe when you get out there and you're in a boardroom and you've got to share your opinion. I know some of you are introverts, but American business discriminates against introverts. You've got to learn how to speak out. And this is the place where you learn how to speak out. So we'll see how things go this week, right? But that was my sort of inspirational kick in the butt to sort of like hopefully try to get some people doing. The other thing that I can do is I may call on people directly. Like, hey, I haven't heard from you. What do you think? And I don't want to like put some people in the corner and ask them a question they don't know the answer to, but try to provide an opportunity where there's not a high stakes question. It could be a guessing game. Just find out what their opinion is on something and get them out of their shell. And I think that's another way to sort of get us closer to an open environment. Yeah. So those are the tricks that I've tried. I think that's one of the hard things, because a lot of times, especially if you're teaching a master's course, some of the stuff is advanced and it's technical, right? But some of it also is conceptual and the students have never been exposed to it before. So there's got to be a certain level where you have to you've got to scaffold it a little bit. You can't just throw them in the deep end. So you start off asking basic questions. It's like, what would happen if, this happened? How would you feel, right? Okay. And then you kind of bring them through that logic, and sooner or later they kind of get the basic idea of the concept, and then you man, this is what scholars say. And it's just the basic thing that you just experienced right here, but this is the connection between what you think you already know based on your own knowledge, connected with this more advanced concept, which we can now apply to a lot of different circumstances. So you got to ease them along. And I like the open discussion. Like I'll give you an example. Last week, when I start talking about currency, I pull out my wallet, I pull out a dollar bill, and I say, I'm going to ask you a bunch of stupid questions. You're going to think these are stupid, right? But how would you feel if I gave you one of these? It's just like, I can give you one, right? And then they started getting grabby and all this sort of stuff. I tease them and taunt them and so on. And I'm like, okay, so why? And then they were like, oh, because I'll be richer, whatever, right? And I'm like, so what if you took this into McDonald's and they didn't take it? And people are like, what? Shock? What? Right? And so we start talking about the value and about how some countries, they don't take their own currency. I mean, we go down this whole line. But the idea is that the notion to some students that currency would have a value relative to something else, and that would be based on supply and demand, is, that's kind of a weird thing. You can think about it a little more when you're talking about mugs, but it's hard to kind of comprehend when you talk about something that's less material, like dollars, which here is material, but in my pocket it's on a credit card. It's zeros and ones, right? It's completely psychological. So how do you get students to sort of like take this sort of esoteric thing and make it more solid? Well, you have to start with basic stuff, and then you move them toward this idea that like, what would happen if I had a room full of dollars? Would anybody care about dollars anymore? What if there was only one and it's everything you had to survive, right? What would you kill in order to get that dollar, right? So you have to work with those concepts, and then sooner or later, once they get that down, then you can talk about currency values and how it is that a strong currency can buy a lot, a weak currency can't buy that much, and so on. So, and again, that's another trick I do sometimes, is like actual, like, using physical devices, things that sort of like people can look at and touch. Subset of the Socratic method, I think, is deconstruction. Taking something that students just believe is absolutely true, but it's not true, right, and tearing that apart. I think that's a really effective way sometimes of getting people interested. Having debates, right? A lot of times there's different ways to approach things, so have some people have half the class take this particular perspective, have the other class take the other one, whether they believe it or not, have them just role play. Short videos, that's something Jim's already talked about, but that's another thing I think is an effective tool. Okay. I do think it's a good idea to sort of mix things up so you aren't the only one doing the talking. But the cool thing Jim does in his class, though, in marketing management, is Jim has been responsible for the production of, like, I don't know, thousands of commercials or something in his career. And he will, like, show commercials and have students sort of analyze those things. So you watch a short video, you watch a little commercial, and have the students sort of deconstruct, like, how did this person, how did this provider provide this for a client, right? What was involved in this? And it's a very practical kind of exercise, and again, definitely moves in that active learning direction. So here's sort of a checklist of the kinds of things that might engage students. Okay, these are researched by various scholars, and keep in mind that this checklist is not something that you would incorporate into every activity. These are just different ideas of things that might be engaging, right? So incorporating higher order thinking. That is, if I could start at that sort of basic level and bring them up to something more complex, something that is going to mentally challenge them, then sometimes that mental challenge has the opportunity to stimulate people and get them more active. Challenging but achievable, right? You don't want things to be too easy for students. They get bored, right? You don't want to make it completely out of reach either, but you have to push them just beyond their capacity. Otherwise, they tend to be sedentary. Variety or novelty, something that's interesting, like pull the dollar out of my pocket, right? And that's unusual, right? Do things that are unusual, right? Like I have a CD over here of really bad Eurosceptic music that I picked up in the UK, and maybe in a break, and by really bad I mean the guy can't sing. So really entertaining way to sort of talk about, like, Brexit and things like that, right? Somebody want it? Steve? With my question ball, right? They put their thumb on a number 10, I have a list of questions. They answer the question, right? Whatever that question is. The first week it might be, what's your favorite color? Second week it might be, what do you think of free trade? Arouses curiosity. Explained that when we talked about natural selection simulations, right? But likewise, like when I'm starting to talk about currency, which is really boring for a lot of people, and you guys are like, currency, right? And students get the same way too. If there's something I can do to make students curious about stuff, that's great. That's the goal. That's what I want. I want them to be curious when they're not in my class. Something that allows for collaboration, okay? When they're not just listening to me, but they're working in smaller groups themselves, that's good news. Competition, right? I mean, students, it depends on the situation, but I think sometimes when you have competitive games, students dig it, right? And especially our population of students, there's a lot of athletes in a lot of our classes, and they are naturally competitive, and they respond pretty positively to a lot of this stuff. Giving students control and choice, right? What role are they going to play? Give them a role and let them be flexible in the way they're going to play that out, right? Experiential, hands-on, right? Something that students can do that mimics the stuff that they may do in the real world, or something that's just, interesting, that creates an experience. Has real-life collections. And relevance, right? And this is where I say sell it, something I mentioned before. My educational philosophy, or at least a part of it, assumes that students come into my class and they don't care about anything I have to say. I just go in here with that default position, that they might want a degree, they might want a piece of paper, they may want to jump through the hoops to get it done, but they don't really want to be here. So my job is to make them want to be here. my job is to make them care about all this stuff up here. And that may mean that I'm pulling out all of my tricks and stuff like that, but it also means that I have to make them believe that what I have to say is important, right? Like there's something that we're doing today in this class that you might experience next week that might be important to you, that might help you in some certain way, right? So sales, I believe teaching is sales. In fact, I think teaching is more sales than it is teaching, if you will. Because if I'm just sharing information and they don't think it's important, do you think they're going to pay attention? No. But if I convince them that it's important, then they will have retention. And even if they don't retain, if they care, then later on they'll know where to find it. They won't need me anymore. And that's my gift to them. So that's my approach. And I encourage everybody to sort of, if you come into a classroom level set, assuming the students don't want to learn, and you create an environment that is inherently inviting to people, then you've gone a long way toward trying to make this thing work. I want to talk about active learning and personality, because I think that your personality and your individual gifts may have something to do with what you can deliver in the classroom. So, question, just remember the best teachers you ever had. Tell me one thing that you loved, something maybe you could replicate and make your own, or maybe you already have replicated it, because some of you have been teachers for a long time, right? I can ask you about the worst teachers too, maybe that's another thing you want to do, but this is a list of some of them that I know people have mentioned before, and there's obviously it's not an exhaustive list here. One of them that I really love is enthusiasm, right? And I think that's a key thing, especially if you're teaching 8 o'clock in the morning or 9:30 at night. It's hard for students to get their enthusiasm up, but if you don't have your enthusiasm up, they are finished, right? So I think that's really key. And I think if you really care, if you're excited about the thing that you are sharing, then that enthusiasm should come out. And if you are not enthusiastic about this thing that you're sharing, then you need to rework and think about how you can get there. And that's something I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes. How do you get there, right? Sense of humor, right? Storytelling, that kind of thing. Love, right? Caring about your students, knowing that they really, you're getting that sort of service kind of love. You're putting them first, and you have an interest in them and their outcomes, right? Spontaneity, provocative, challenging, right? There's just, anyway, I would ask you all to sort of deconstruct that over time. Think about like what you can draw from some of the best teachers that you ever had. And then I would like you to pair that with what about you makes you unique, right? What can you bring into the classroom that makes it special? What are your skills? What are you passionate about? Anything that you've got like that you could translate into the content, personalize it, I think really makes a big difference for students as well. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about AI and active learning because, hey, why not? AI, it's all over the place here. So I want to start off by showing you this model right here. This is sort of garbage in, garbage out. Have you heard about this idea, right? And anybody I know who's dealt with AI, this is always what they tell me. It's like if I say, oh, AI is not perfect, it's got a problem. Well, if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. You ask dumb questions, you're going to get dumb answers, and that's the problem with AI. I've got to say I respectfully disagree with that, based on my experience, but I just went to a workshop recently where it's like, well, you're just not asking the right prompts. If you keep asking and asking and asking, then sooner or later, you're gonna get the right answer. Well, I'm gonna give you an example of something that I did here in preparing for this and make it relevant in terms of active learning, hopefully here. So I actually looked up on Google, what is the average attention span of a human being? And the first answer that I got was this. This is my prompt. What is an average human attention span? And it is 8.25 seconds, less than a goldfish at 9. That was the AI response at the top. Now, to make matters worse, you scroll down and you're looking at the Google sources, like, in regular Google. Almost every article has a link to this study, and it's all over the place. So, do you think this is real? Do you think this is true? Yes? No? Okay. So I have my doubts. So then I type into the very same search engine this. Is human attention span really less than a goldfish? And the answer I get is, that's a myth. The group that did the study has a questionable reputation. And I get a completely different set of results. Okay? I don't think this was a garbage question, but I got garbage out anyway. I had to be smarter than the AI to know, because like literally the whole first page, this is the only answer that you would have gotten. And there wasn't any reference to the quality of the information being bad or wrong. So if that is the only search that I've done, that is what I would come up with, right? I had to question and challenge it in order to push things further. Now, I've used different AIs quite a lot, and ChatGPT is one of my favorites. I actually think it's a great tool. I'm going to show you a little bit, some ideas of things to do with it. But I'm throwing this out here as a general caution that when we are using any kind of AI, the big disclaimer is that you have to be smarter than the AI, because the AI will spit junk at you, and this is why I'm a little concerned about turning students loose with it, right? I think it's a good search engine, but it needs to be, you need to verify it, at least at this stage of its development. It may get better at guessing what we want.
No.
Okay, Andrew says no, it won't. I do think it's a good tool, right? But I also think that before you use anything, then it's a problem. So you have to be careful. So I had a class my first week. I was teaching global management, and as I usually do the first week, I'm teaching Porter's Diamond. And Porter's Diamond is not the most exciting thing I ever like to teach students about. And I went through and I was doing it, and students were I could tell they're kind of glazing over. It's an important thing, but it's like, I'm not even that excited about it. It's okay, right? So I'm thinking, all right, how can I turn it into a game? What can I do? So I actually go to ChatGPT, and I'm like, what's up, Chat? I copy and paste some of my PowerPoint slides into the machine, and I say, this was not a very exciting lecture. I'm pasting in the material. Any ideas on jokes, game simulations, or interesting examples I can use to improve it, okay? So I'm like, hey, and this is, I think, a really good use of ChatGPT, is the creative process, right? They have more data than I do, and that's helpful. So what do I get? Well, I get some pretty good answers. There's a country showdown game, a Shark Tank Diamond Edition, improv challenge, right? And it's got like you divide students into small groups, assign each group a different country. Like, it's doing a lot of the mental work that I would do for myself. And I think that's really cool, right? So I like country showdown game. That looks kind of cool. So, and I'm doing this for real, because like next time I teach this class, I probably will do a country showdown game if ChatGPT can help me do it without too much work on my own part, right? So I go here and I'm like, okay. So I say, let's build up the country showdown game. Let's do 5 countries, industries for 5 groups. We give each group enough information to apply each of the industries to aspects of the diamond. I go on and I describe it, right? So then ChatGPT gives me student handout, instructor's guide, they identify the game, I read through the game. Once I read through the game, I'm like, meh, not great. This is a good start. I also need sheets to give to each group that give them the data that would allow them to answer these questions. So in other words, they came up with a version of the game that assumed that students knew a lot of information. I needed to explain to them, like, okay, students don't really know any of this stuff, so you have to provide the data to them. Right. So then, next iteration, right, I'm like, are you still working on it? I don't see anything, like it gives me nothing. And then they're like, oh, sorry, okay, I got it. Like, this is what it does sometimes. This is chat's my friend, right? So then they give me another version, and in that version, it has all of the answers per category all lined up for the students. So they have all the answers in front of them. So then I have to tell ChatGPT, you're literally giving the students all the answers. Can you please not do that? Anyway, I don't want to go through the whole thing, but long story short, I have to go through multiple iterations to get to a point where sooner or later I have something where I'm like, okay, this is a pretty good balance. And ultimately, I have to make the judgment call as to whether or not that's a decent product by the time it's all done. So is it worth it? I think it's going to be, it might be worth it. We'll see how the activity turns out. It is something I'm going to try next time I run this class. I think it's a cool idea. But I also think that as with everything you're doing with AI, is you have to bring the expert's knowledge approach to it. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to AI, and just like with the goldfish thing, I get something that's just patently not true. How do we engage students online? The first thing I would say, as much as possible, try to build community. One thing I do is record videos. Like I'll run a video like this in my class and edit it together, stick it up on YouTube. But it's one way for students who are online to get to see me actually talk to them in a way that's, like as if they were in the real classroom. If I've got 2 sections that I'm teaching in the same class, like 2 global management sections, one's online and one's in person, I'll let the online students come in and zoom in to the in-person class instead of doing discussion forums. So that's another way I sometimes do this thing. try to open active learning opportunities where possible. Some of the things that we just talked about are things that can be applied to the online environment. I think it's more difficult sometimes when it's an asynchronous environment, but some can be adapted. And also, I would just say personal contact, right? Trying to make yourself as available as possible to students, to try to reach out to them so that they can actually talk to you one-on-one. And I think that's the best thing you can do, really, as far as trying to support students in that kind of distance situation. Is discussion forums, right? Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not very effective. In order to make them effective, these are some of my suggestions. First of all, deliberate design, okay? You don't want to just throw out discussion forums just because, right? You want them to be designed in such a way they're going to provoke discussion. So if you're asking somebody a fill-in-the-blank question, everybody's going to come up with the same answers. It's not going to be that interesting. You ask them a provocative question that has multiple answers, you're going to have a much better discussion, right? So design, right? Multiple perspectives. Like I said, that if you introduce something with different perspectives, that's going to be a good thing. Also, using alternate formats. Sometimes, like asking students to come up with, maybe in a marketing class, a commercial or something that they've seen, and to analyze it and put that up on the forum, or encourage video responses. That's another thing we're doing more in our design now, is trying to have not just discussion forums where people are writing, but discussion forums where people are posting a video and then responding to each other in video as well. Can sometimes be a little bit more interactive.
9 to 9:50, fatigue can become a reality.
Okay.
In spite of all of our efforts, in spite of all of our videos, everything else, it's a wolf. People are still can run out of gas.
They do. I feel like I've defeated that in the last few years. And I'll tell you how I've done it. One of them is the pacing thing that I was talking about, where I need to make sure that whatever it is that's happening between 9 and 9:50 better be pretty darn engaging, right? That's the time when I pull out the dollar bill and tease them and get them going and interacting with me more. Or maybe that's the time where I have them play a game or do an activity. But the other thing that happens, the worst time for me isn't 9 to 9:50. It's 9:30 to 9:50. That's the hard part. That's the part where people are like looking at the clock and they're really ready to go. So one of the things I've been doing for about the last 2 years that has totally changed the pacing of things, and I know this seems very counterintuitive, but I absolutely do this, is I take the last 5 to 10 minutes of class, I stop at 10:40, and then I have, sounds ridiculous, I have a candlelight moment with the students. Turn off the lights, I put on my little fake candle, and I sit down with them, and I tell them a story. And it's a story, I've got it pre-planned. It's a story that aligns with the lessons that we talked about in this class. I'm trying to think of an example, right? Like the first night of class, we're talking in global management, we're talking about, what kinds of things are you looking at in foreign markets where you might like to land a business, right? And so that's sort of the overall theme. And I talk about the first time that I was outside, North America was in Russia. And I tell them about my experience there, and it was like the early 90s, and how it was like the Wild West. There's mafia guys running all over the place. I had this great idea for a business, but there's no way it would work because, hey, the mafia guys would probably kill me. But that's the thing. It's like I'm sitting down there and telling them about some of my experiences and what it means to think about risk and reject that risk. And so it's a real story that relates to the sorts of things that I'm talking about. In the meantime, it's all sort of dark. I got the candlelight, and they're all sort of like, they're done.
Yeah.
It's sort of a bedtime story.
Yeah.
And they love it. Like every time, they're just like, that was great. And, I actually stole the idea because I've been really involved in scouting, and they do a Scoutmaster minute at the end of a scout meeting. And the Scoutmaster we used to have just did great, these little things. Sometimes they were tear jerkers, or sometimes they're just things that make you think. And I'm like,
But it's real life.
Exactly. I should do that with my class, where it's I've got a lot of stories, I've got a lot of experiences. This is an opportunity for me to connect with students in a more personal way and bring home some of those lessons. And so, usually I'm done straight up at 9:50. All I need is 5 or 10 minutes, a candle, and just talking to them a little bit. And then I crystallize, and then I close by basically saying, look, this is a great session. I appreciate you having attention. I know that keeping your attention on us during this time. It's a 4-hour class. thanks for all that. And I don't know, it's just, you try to end on a very positive note, and then you send them off, and hopefully they're happy coming back next time. The idea is you take that red zone that's from between 9:30 and 9:50, and you cut it by 10 minutes, and you radically do something novel and different, which brings their attention back in, but also sort of like sums things up and sends them back into the world. I appreciate all of you being here. Thank you for your contributions. So,
Thank you, Mark.
yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, Mark.
That's great.
Very
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thanks for saying.
Yeah, no problem.